Is that alas, how did the Prussian army dominate Europe in the 1800s? This woman with a history.
She can almost hear the words in her beloved's voice. Marie von Clausewitz sorts through her late husband's papers, a seemingly bottomless well of military musings and observations. In these pages is written the theory of Karl von Clausewitz, the man whose book would lead the charge to turn Prussia from a military failure shamed by Napoleon into the military leader of Europe. As she reads her husband's words, it's as if Marie is on the battlefield at Auerstedt, the Prussian cavalry breaking around her as Napoleon's squares put them to rout. She feels the sting of defeat marching in the loping retreat, the horse bearing the now eyeless and mortally wounded Duke of Brunswick passing. Marie will live to publish her beloved's treatise on the art of war, but not to see its effect. The Grand Army of Prussia crushing the stagnant French and the proclamation of a new German Empire in the very seat of French vanity. Hi, I'm Griffin Johnson, the Armchair Historian. Voltaire once quipped that while many states have an army, the Prussian Royal Army had a state. Though thoroughly cliched by now, Voltaire's words are strikingly true. Military service and philosophy were key pillars of Prussian society and helped this small, militaristic kingdom become the force that would create a united Germany, and whose descendants would plunge the world into conflicts of titanic proportions. In today's video, we will chronicle what we believe are the twin historical times that made the Prussian army the military juggernaut history buffs know, and in some cases, love. From the embarrassments at the hands of Napoleon to the jubilation at Versailles, this is a concise overview of the evolution of the Prussian army.
Let's go.
One of the key factors that allowed the Prussian army to win wars was military intelligence. In the Franco-Prussian War, many Prussian officers had toured France in their youth, memorizing the terrain and fortifications. This brings us to the sponsor of today's video, NordVPN, which The fire that would forge the modern Prussian army was first kindled during the Napoleonic Wars, when Prussia stood alongside the rest of the Fourth Coalition as they made their attempt to strike down the would-be tyrant of Europe, once and for all. But the Prussian steel, initially forged by the military genius of Frederick the Great, had grown brittle and rusty over the years, leaving the nation fielding a force as disorganized as it was toothless. The Royal Army had become a haven for social climbers seeking to use military service to advance their own careers, and these politically minded officers rode the coattails of their forebearers, lazily implementing tried strategies that were highly predictable. Petty bureaucracy and rivalries between these complacent officers exacerbated the Royal Army's issues. The net result of all of this was a force whose rank-and-file soldiers were disciplined and proud to serve, but whose movements were ponderous and predictable. Von Clausewitz likened the Royal Army to a damaged building. Behind the facade, all was mildewed. Jena Auerstedt saw the French outmaneuver the mildewed Prussians, particularly at Auerstedt. At this fight, 52,000 Prussians attacked an invading French army half their size. But the Prussian officers lived up to their reputation, evincing an utter lack of coordination and failing to press their numerical advantage during their initial engagements, letting Napoleon's army launch a bold counteroffensive. The Imperial French routed their Germanic foes, pursuing the Prussians all the way to Berlin. Their capital occupied, the Prussians put on a brave but ultimately futile resistance, with the rest of the kingdom falling to the French in less than a month. This shameful display was witnessed by the men whose names would be written on the pages of military history. the aforementioned von Clausewitz, future officer corps reformer Gerhard von Scharnhorst, organizational mastermind August von Gneisenau, and future Waterloo victor Gebert von Blücher. This cadre witnessed the embarrassment of their kingdom's military and would go on to play key roles in Prussia's reclaiming of her military honor. But before Prussia could rise, she had to fall. Napoleon dragged Prussia to the negotiating table and foisted the Peace of Tilsit on them in 1807, hobbling its armed forces and seizing large portions of Prussian territory. King Frederick Wilhelm III, determined to not let this happen to his kingdom ever again, assembled the Military Reform Commission not long thereafter. Their purpose was simple: find what went wrong in the fight against Napoleon and correct it with vigor. Von Scharnhorst and von Gneisenau would lead the commission, ably assisted by von Clausewitz, who would later use his notes from their meetings as the basis for On War. The commission's main reforms were ending corporal punishment in the ranks, introducing combined arms tactics, and advocating for mass conscription. Von Scharnhorst used his part to introduce meritocracy into the Prussian officer corps, opening it up to candidates outside of the aristocracy and advocating for an officer's qualifications to be, in peace, knowledge and education; in times of war, courage and conduct. For the next 6 years, Napoleon would campaign and conquer, while Prussia reformed. Martial training was deeply embedded into general education, and while the questionably qualified officers proved difficult to sack, Scharnhorst's push for more recruiting gave the kingdom's nepotistic and self-aggrandizing generals a competent group of assistants at the very least. By 1813, King Frederick Wilhelm III had a much improved force at his disposal, and the will to use it. Napoleon's devastating defeat in Russia gave Frederick his opening, and as France licked its frostbitten wounds, Prussia moved in on the injured empire. In what would become known as the War of Liberation, Prussia marshaled a full 6% of its population to reclaim its territory and its honor. Though improved, the Royal Army still had some travails facing Napoleon's forces, but the Sixth Coalition succeeded where the other 5 had failed, and Napoleon was removed from power. With the fall of the French Empire, Prussia joined the other victorious allies in re-establishing control of the continent and stood poised to implement its most ambitious reforms yet. September 3, 1814 saw a tectonic shift in Prussian society. Frederick introduced conscription for all Prussian males over age 20. 3 forces made up the new military apparatus: the main standing army, the militia, and the reserves, with the entire adult male population of Prussia distributed among them. One way or another, a Prussian man served. It was this conscription force that joined the Duke of Wellington in defeating Napoleon at Waterloo in 1815. Led by von Blücher, the Prussians were instrumental in defeating and pursuing Napoleon's forces, launching a fantastically successful attack on the would-be emperor's right. Prussia once again sat at the victor's table and witnessed the creation of the German Confederation, which would be replaced in time by a united Germany under the Prussian banner.
The
roughly 30 years following Frederick Wilhelm III's Grand Reform saw a number of key events that reshaped the face of war in Europe. New weapons like the breech-loading rifle and rifled cannon were introduced. Sanitation was brought to the forefront due to the horrors of the Crimean War, and telegraphs gave the world near-instant long-distance communication for the first time in history. As the world evolved at an unprecedented rate, so too did Prussia. Educational rigor became a focus of the army's development, with examinations for entrance into the officer corps introduced in 1844. Interestingly, for a society as seemingly militarized as Prussia's, there was a gradual disfavor of an entirely military education. Examinations for promotion and entrance would require not only the demonstration of military knowledge, but a keen general knowledge as well. The focus on education extended to all levels of the military, even the common soldiers. Unlike most other European counterparts, just about every single man in the Prussian army could read and write. This
That's
seemingly
good.
simple addition had dramatic and far-reaching implications. Now, men could be taught advanced concepts using books and training manuals that could be studied while off-duty and even during civilian life. This
Okay,
also
may mga
radically
spot,
improved
smart, ha?
battlefield cohesion and strengthened lines of communication between units. Never again would a lucky shot paralyze a whole platoon by killing one officer who could read orders to his men. Prussia's growth was not isolated to education, however. The kingdom was an early adoptee of both the aforementioned breech loaders and rifled cannons, in the form of the Dresa needle gun and the infamous Krupp gun. The Dresa was a breech-loading weapon that relied on a pre-packaged paper cartridge rather than a separate shot and powder. The cartridge contained a bullet, powder, and a percussion cap which was struck by a needle within the chamber to fire, hence needle gun. The Dresa was far easier to load than a muzzle-loaded musket thanks to its cartridge and breech system, but the all-too-essential needle was prone to damage from burning powder and the elements, as the action was not airtight. The main advantage of the Dresa ultimately lay in the fact that early adoption meant the army had almost 30 years of experience with a modern quick-firing infantry weapon, while the rest of Europe was still struggling to transition away from the musket. On the other hand, the revolutionary Krupp guns were a series of breech-loading field artillery pieces made of cast steel. A common example was the C-67 6-pound gun, able to accurately deposit high-explosive canister shells onto targets up to 5 miles or 8 kilometers away. This was almost twice the effective range of the cannons still used by most European nations. Additionally, Krupp artillery shells used some of the first contact detonators, removing the need to keep large stockpiles of timed fuses on hand for different ranges. These advantages would prove decisive in the critical war that would see the Kingdom of Prussia reforge itself into the Empire of Germany. Avid armchair viewers are doubtless familiar with the importance of the Franco-Prussian War. This key event is the linchpin of Prussian military dominance and the climactic event of their military evolution. This was due largely to the efforts of one man, Field Marshal Helmut von Moltke. A dedicated student of von Clausewitz, Moltke oversaw a victorious revolution in the Prussian army greater than anything Frederick William III could have dreamt of. The Prussian army that marched to war against the lesser of the two Napoleons would ride the rails of military modernization to victory, literally. As chief of the General Staff, von Moltke had laid careful preparations for this final war of German unification. He and his subordinates oversaw an expansion in Prussia's railway network purpose-built for the rapid deployment of troops. Each and every addition to the communications, Moltke remarked, especially the railroads, must be considered a military advantage. It was an advantage Prussia would need, as von Moltke knew that his army was equal to, if not smaller than, most forces on the continent. Efficiency and tactics would make the difference, since Prussia could not drown its enemies in a tide of conscripts like the Russians, or starve her foes into submission with a wooden wall like the British and their navy. Von Moltke would instead focus on speed. In a grim foreshadowing of Blitzkrieg less than a century later, the objective of the Prussian army would be to overwhelm its force by lightning-fast deployment. Using railroads and telegraphs, the Prussians would attempt to swamp their enemy in the opening stages of the campaign, using the aid of the railroads to shuttle their men to the best defensive positions or get them into the most advantageous position to fall upon their enemies. On a broader level, von Moltke pressed for a goal of encirclement, mobilizing his forces along a broad front to envelop and crush his opponent at the fastest possible pace. But von Moltke's mind was not just of metal and wheels. Ever the logistical mastermind, von Moltke posited the idea of march divided, fight united, which would see the Prussian army divide its forces for deployment only to reorganize into a massive force to fight a decisive battle. Smaller forces proved less stressful on supply lines, and if one such subsidiary force was somehow set upon and destroyed by the enemy, the army as a whole would survive to avenge their fallen comrades. And when these smaller units coalesced and battle was joined, von Moltke knew that if their commanders hewed strictly to the letter of their orders, the battle was lost, This was the traditional way of
splitting
doing
and
battle, with the
uniting
generals
them.
at the top giving specific orders and their commanders following them in the most literal sense, no matter the result. Thus, von Moltke introduced the idea of giving subordinate commanders the initiative to react to changes on the battlefield while still serving the intent of their orders. After all, as the man himself said, no plan survives contact with the enemy, and by giving commanders on the ground the ability to react in real time, von Moltke hoped to take advantage of the training and education Prussia had focused so hard on giving its officers. Like many geniuses, von Moltke's ideas were not initially well received in their time. In particular, the aforementioned empowering of junior officers, which was dubbed Auftragstaktik, or mission-type tactics, was seen as reckless and costly should the junior commanders falter. The simple truth was that von Moltke's ideas were anathema to the prevailing Napoleonic-era military mindset, which treated war like a chessboard, with a centralized command staff manipulating the movements of each piece down to the finest detail. Meanwhile, under the Prussian way of doing things, field commanders were granted broad authority in reacting to the shifting situation on the battlefield. If a Prussian commander saw a glaring opening to exploit a lapse in his enemy's judgment or a sudden twist of fortune, he had the ability to pursue it with vigor. A Napoleonic commander, on the other hand, would be forced to watch such opportunities slip through his fingers, with the penalty of immediate court-martial if he dared defy the centralized command structure. Thus were the Prussians able to outthink and outmaneuver their enemies, in addition to outdeploying them. After years of careful planning and training, the new Prussian army was finally tested in battle against the Austrians in the Austro-Prussian War of 1866. Using 5 separate train lines, the Prussians were able to storm across the border and quickly coalesce into 3 army groups that totally outflanked their shocked Austrian adversaries. The initial engagements quickly showed the value of the Dresa needle gun, whose high rate of fire enabled the Prussians to decimate the Austrian infantry at close range. Yet at long range, Austrian muzzleloaders proved more accurate, and a lack of Krupp guns meant that the enemy artillery often outranged Moltke's own. But at the climactic Battle of Königgrätz, the Prussians were able to decisively outmaneuver their Austrian opponents and inflict some 20,000 casualties while taking another 22,000 prisoners of war. The war ended in a total Prussian victory and served as a vital proving ground for Moltke's new stratagems, giving him time to refine and perfect his techniques just in time for war against France, which broke out just 4 years later in 1870. With von Moltke at their head, the Prussians were able to deliver a stunning defeat to the French, ironically using one of Napoleon Bonaparte's favorite tactics against them. The Prussians' victory was secured through skillful use of modern artillery, carrying on the legacy of the first French emperor in the fight against the second. Von Moltke's forces were armed with the latest in breech-loading cannon from the infamous Krupp arms factories. The climactic Battle of Sedan saw the Prussians reach the height of their artillerist powers, skillfully bombing the French into submission and securing the victory that forged the German Empire. With the victory over France, the German Empire was declared in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, and the evolution of the Prussian army was complete. From their defeat at the hands of Napoleon I, the Prussians took the lesson of making war a science, a thing to be thought of and philosophized over in addition to waged. Prussian officers became educated technocrats, and a push for innovation in tactics and arms saw this small Germanic kingdom cast a large shadow over all of Europe. From the pages of von Clausewitz to the timetables of von Moltke, Prussia's rise was orchestrated by masterful generals and logisticians, united in one purpose: crush their enemies, elevate their kingdom, and never know the shame of defeat again.
This ending. So this during the Napoleon era, the stories of the Napoleon pa. This is an interesting man. So make sure to video there for now. Make sure to subscribe for more and see this video.